The gavel never came down. It clattered against the bench and skittered off, a tiny, absurd sound in the thunder of breath that filled the courtroom. Alessandra Vera's breath, ragged and raw, and the collective intake of 100 strangers who had decided in a single awful heartbeat that they were watching a woman fall. Her lawyer's chair stood empty. The man who had shuffled legalese into armor for her was gone, phone buzzing like a wasp in his palm as he fled down the aisle, his whisper apologies swallowed by camera shutters. Alessandra had stood then, not in the sleek, controlled way the press had catalogued for years, but as if some invisible seam had split and all the careful stitching of her life had come undone. Her knuckles were white on the witness box. Her jaw trembled. For the first time, the world could see. The billionaire who had taught an entire generation of crows how to circle was simply a woman, and she was unraveling in public. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Mateo Cruz had his mop bucket between his knees and the last of the hallway lights in his wake, and he should have been invisible. 10 years of shifts, 10 years of learning when to be a shadow, how to push a broom without calling attention, how to time a floor polish so that witnesses couldn't see his hands. He'd learned to be the quiet presence in the room, an ex-Marine who had traded salvos for squeegees, a man with a chest full of old orders and a face that kept its weather to itself. But the way Alessandra's eyes went glassy, the whiplash of a courtroom suddenly stripped of its choreography, it did something inside him that mortar and caution could not hold. He rose before he meant to. The mop clattered against tile. The bucket sloshed. Heads turned because people always turned when someone different moved in the wrong rhythm. Cameras pivoted, microphones swung like beetles. Mateo's voice left him raw. "I will defend her." It wasn't a legal proclamation. He knew nothing of statutes or cross-examinations, and his palms remembered only the rough oaks of cleats and gun stocks. It was a human thing, a vow that reached back to a promise he'd given in another life, an oath to stand and to hold if another fell, and the sound of it hung in the room like a dare. Silence swallowed the declaration. For a second, it was not madness. It was an electrostatic moment where the courtroom's gravity must choose a new center. Alessandra looked at him as if someone had flipped on a strange piercing light. Her eyes, usually measured with the kind of cold that had financed empires, were wet. "Who are you?" she asked, and the question was less about identity than wonder. "Mateo Cruz," he said. "I sweep this courthouse. I know the floor's seams. I know how to keep things from tearing." He heard how small he sounded next to the echo of international franchises and legal titans. He wanted to sink back into the uniform that made him nothing, but he couldn't. The same hands that had once gripped rifle stocks steadied themselves on the fringe of a life that had become superstition and paper and silent loyalty. Outside, the press camped like scavengers, their lenses spitting out a stream of images that would seed rumors and dossiers. Inside, the prosecutor's team exchanged looks full of calculation. This was a vulnerability they could exploit. This was an untidy thing to smooth into a conviction. Judges consulted notes as if the law were a map to reroute the tide. Alessandra's seat at the head of the gallery, usually a throne of glass and indifference, seemed suddenly precarious, as if the weight of the room might tip her right off it. Alessandra Vieri, at 42, walked the kind of line only an heiress born to iron and silk could walk. CEO of Vieri Global, a conglomerate whose subsidiaries made hospital beds one day and shipped mercenaries the next, whose facade of legitimate industry hid tendrils that extended into the midnight markets of cyber contraband and human debts. Her name toppled governments in whispered auctions and settled wars with a signature that could be traced through encrypted ledgers. She had been raised on whispered codes of honor. Protect your family, honor your debts, and never let weakness show. Now, with a lawyer gone and witnesses shifting like minnows, she was exposed as a human whose mistakes had consequences and whose mistakes had murdered people. For Mateo, the danger was simpler and older, an intimacy with the idea of responsibility that had no license. He had been a sergeant in the Corps once, a man who had seen the soft center of things rotten in place. He'd left on a paper trail of discretion, of favors unpaid, and truths that had to be kept under leather. He had scrubbed his past into clean floors and quiet nights in a one-room apartment above a laundromat. He had held himself to small, honorable things: fix a door, sweep a hallway, keep hands clean. Defending a millionaire wasn't in the job description, but defending someone in the act of falling, this was closer to the heartbeat he had refused to let die. The room hummed with rumor. A tech-savvy prosecutor kept checking a tablet, lips moving as if the pixels could be made to say what the law could not. A bailiff at the back called a name into a radio, and the sound of it was like a wire tightened. No one seemed to understand why the lawyer had bolted. Whispers suggested threats, a rival family's reach, a whisper that a certain prosecutor had been bought, and that confidential files had already been copied and corrupted. Alessandra's inner circle, executives in tailored grief, a man with a silver beard who had been her consigliere since childhood, murmured and fanned themselves with statements. "This is strategic," the beard murmured, close enough for Mateo to hear. "It's a maneuver. The man will return. Keep calm." Alessandra did not seem to trust the word calm. Her mouth worked as if the syllables were rocks. She took a breath and tried to recompose herself into the sculpted figure the cameras knew how to frame. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," she shot out, the steel faintly returning to the edges of her voice. But it was not conviction, it was borrowed. Her knuckles left a crescent of pale on the witness box. 20-second glances ticked by like an inactive bomb. Mateo could see the fine tremor of her hand. He could imagine the kind of terror that sleepwalker mothers and aging soldiers and empresses felt when the world they commanded began to strip them of control. He thought about the men and women who toiled in Vieri factories, who depended on the conglomerate's payrolls, and about the worst things that would happen if the network collapsed into war. He thought about the ghosts he had promised to keep quiet, the informant in a rain-soaked alley, the cell that had been dismantled by his own testimony 10 years ago, and the men he'd watched fall because he had refused to fire. He thought about the janitorial oath he'd muttered to himself during slow nights, that you sweep up, you don't run from the spill. "You can't defend her," whispered someone behind him, a city attorney with a mouth that tasted of tribunal. "You're a janitor. Step down." Mateo met the whisper with a quiet, "I'm not stepping down." The words surprised him, the soft, stubborn thing that came out of a lifetime of being overlooked. In the courtroom, an invisible man had chosen, in an instant, to be visible. Alessandra's gaze wasn't gratitude yet. It was analysis, the kind of mental arithmetic that had built her empire. A janitor equals nothing in her ledger. Nothing could be capitalized. But there was another computation in there, one wild, dangerous, human. If her lawyer would not stand, if the law itself had been neutered by money or fear, what did a courtroom become but a theater where character could still create miracles? She had always been a woman who bent instruments to her will. There was a peculiar audacity in considering that a man who mopped the floor might be the only thing standing between her and ruin. The bailiff cleared his throat and adjudicated, "This isn't a hearing for—" He stopped because the judge had risen from the bench like a monarch uncertain of the coronet. The courtroom seemed to tilt. the atmosphere an oscilloscope of pulses, public hunger, private dread, the machine of justice stuttering. Cameras clicked. Social feeds would call it a scandal and name it a spectacle, but inside it was a crucible. And in a crucible, degrees mattered. The heat that bent iron could also melt it. Outside, in the courthouse corridor where Mateo had pushed his mop and collected secrets, a young clerk had already slid a confidential printout under her arm. "There are files missing," she murmured to Mateo when a break in the chaos allowed a whisper. "Audio traces. Someone's got in." Her voice carried the kind of alertness that said the game's rules had been rewritten. "Who?" Mateo asked. She shrugged. "Could be anyone. Hackers trade favors like cigarettes. A disgruntled partner. Your janitor's boldness will make a good headline." The irony, a man who had always been paid to keep things tidy might now be the subject keeping a paper trail alive, was not lost on Mateo. As cameras streamed and the judge tried to restore order, a hush fell oddly tender and intimate in the space between two people who had nothing in common on paper. Mateo, mop head drooping, stood with a defiance older than his uniform. He would not let a woman be left to fall alone. Alessandra, a titan in cashmere and rumor, stood vulnerable and human, the armor shed worn reduced to a costume that could not protect against the fact of her trembling. A difficult dilemma presented itself as the first act closed. The world wanted spectacle. Prosecutors wanted a victory. Rival families smelled opportunity. And between all of them stood a janitor whose moral compass pointed suddenly public, and a billionaire who had never before asked anyone for that kind of simple, uncontracted protection. Mateo had stepped into a space he had no right to claim, but rights had never stopped him before when a life was at stake. He could step back. He could let the legal machinery grind and pray it serve justice. Or he could stand and, without credentials and with the small weapon of human resolve, try to hold together a woman teetering on the edge of a fall that would not only destroy her, but rip open a world of violence and consequence that would hurt thousands. The choice was not legal. It was moral and messy and immediate. Mateo clenched his hands until the skin at his knuckles paled. He would not look away. The room smelled like old paper and the metallic tang of fear. Cameras had become a living chorus, and their lenses were mouths that chewed every falter into headlines. Mateo felt the weight of those hungry optics like an indictment. He could have retreated down the aisle, mop and bucket forgotten, and let the legal machinery, corrupt and calculating, run its course. Instead, he found himself escorted by nothing more than momentum and a gravity of his own making towards a small cluster of empty chairs near the defense table. Alessandra watched him come with the same precise appraisal she used on boardrooms and battlefields, assessing distance, capability, leverage. She did not yet soften. She could not. Softness in her world had costs that were liquid and violent. But an untrained, unpromised man standing in a courtroom to defend her had altered the ledger in a way a signature never could. For a sliver of a second, she allowed something like curiosity to fracture the practiced mask. Then she remembered the cameras and the man who had fled and the look constricted back into calculation. "Do you understand what you just did?" she asked, voice low but carrying. It was not accusation at first, it was a test. In her life, every ally was a variable, every gesture an investment. She needed to know whether Mateo's words were a performance or a commitment. Mateo swallowed around the dryness in his throat. "Enough to know I can't watch you fall," he said. "Not when there's—" He had not meant to gesture at the empire of paper and dark wires and human lives behind her. The gesture landed like a blow. It was not just sympathy, it was recognition of consequence. That recognition changed the room. Prosecutors narrowed their jaws. Reporters leaned in. Somewhere, a phone lit up with an alert that a janitor had thrown down a gauntlet. But the real change was in Alessandra's circle. Her consigliere, the silver-bearded man named Dante, made himself smaller in his chair as if he were an animal expecting a thunderclap. Executive eyes that had always measured profit in percentages now flicked with fear at the possibility that a single act of human loyalty might upset the safest calculus they had. Money buys silence. Secret laws buy acquittal. Matteo's declaration introduced a variable they had not run through their simulations. "What do you want?" Alessandra asked finally, the steel edging back into her voice like cold, polished metal. She had every reason to distrust motives. In her world, kindness was either a ledger to be balanced or a blade to be used. She needed to know whether he wanted leverage, publicity, payment, fame, the kind of intangible that endemic to legal theater. "Nothing," Matteo said. It was true in the way that a soldier saying nothing accepts the world is sometimes enough. He did not want money. He did not want headlines. He wanted something simpler and more dangerous. To keep a promise he had sworn to himself long ago, when ghosts had needed names and he had refused to let them fall. "I want to keep you standing." Alessandra's laugh was a quiet, small thing, not humor, but a defense mechanism that had protected her through boardroom battles and midnight coups. "You cannot legally represent me," she said, stating fact. "You do not understand evidence law, procedure, cross-examination." "I understand people," Matteo answered, "and I understand the weight of a fall." It was not an argument that would carry in any courtroom official minute, but it landed in the human space where juries made decisions and where lives were sometimes saved or ended. For a millisecond, the judge, who had been trying to stitch the theater back together, looked at Matteo not as a breach of protocol, but as a human anomaly he could not ignore. The bailiff, sensing a media frenzy, leaned forward with an instinct more political than legal. This could become a story worth containing or exploiting. "Procedurally, this cannot happen," the prosecutor said, sharper now. He tried to corral the moment back to law and precedent. But law is flesh. Law is made by people who change when moved. Alessandra gave a slow exhale and, to the courtroom's astonishment, shook her head. "Let him speak," she said. The words were a small earthquake. It was not permission out of respect. It was strategic. She accepted the chaos because control had other dimensions. Ally selection was one of them. Matteo wasn't naive about the theater. He knew, vaguely, about objections and hearsay. He knew enough law to understand he had no box to stand in, and yet too many nights of instinct not to try. He moved forward a step, as if obeying a call he'd been raised to answer. Protect at all costs. "I can't cross-examine," he said aloud, "but I can tell the truth I saw." It was not an admission of competence, but one of witness. He had been everywhere this courthouse had been, incidental operator of its underbelly, privy to the hallway husks of secrets, the overheard slivers of phone conversations at dawn. His testimony would be personal, unvarnished, and dangerous in its simplicity. The prosecutor's retort was immediate. "Objection, this is improper. He's not qualified." The judge's gavel hovered, then dropped with a sound that tried to be final but felt unsure. "Temporary consideration," he said, more to himself than to anyone. "Given the extraordinary circumstances and the absence of counsel, the court will entertain a short statement." It was the judicial equivalent of a crack in the ice. It was enough. When Matteo rose, his body remembered 1,000 procedures of a life before polish and mop. Stand steady, speak plainly, don't let your nerves set the tone. He walked to the center with the awkward dignity of someone who knew his worth but had not been taught to display it. He looked at the jury, people with lives that had never intersected his beyond the moment, and then at Alessandra. Her face had a hardness tempered by a fragile new humanity. She did not look like a criminal to him. She looked like a woman who had been made strong to survive, whose strength had, in places, become a weapon used on others. It complicated his oath. "I won't lie to you," he told the courtroom. "I don't know the law. I know people. I know fear. I know what happens when a leader falls and there's no one to steady them." His voice did not thunder with rhetoric. It was a low, searching thing. He told small truths, how he'd seen the Vieri logo on trucks delivering to clinics and on crates bound for places where laws blurred. How he'd once watched a frightened man handed over in an alley because he couldn't pay a debt to men who collected in more permanent ways. He spoke of the human cost, and when he spoke those things, the room tilted again. Not because he was learned, but because he spoke of consequence. Alessandra listened. He could see her throat work. For her, every word about consequence was a ledger reopened. She had built and defended an empire that fed thousands, leased hope like oxygen to towns, and also sometimes crushed dissent with ruthless exactitude. Matteo's words did not excuse, nor did they indict. They introduced a new frame, the personhood behind the dossiers. After Matteo's brief, improbable statement, the tenor of the courtroom shifted. The public, who had expected spectacle, found themselves holding a different currency, raw human narrative. The prosecutor, sensing audience sway, doubled down with crossfire, technicalities, precedents, the shape of statutes, hoping to return things to the comfortable script where he could predict outcomes. The press began to call the moment a twist, as if human lives were plot devices to be serially consumed. Alessandra's inner circle shuffled like cards, counting risks. Then came the first blow. A notification buzzed on the prosecutor's tablet, and the prosecutor's face went paler than Matteo had seen. "We have a leak," he announced. "Additional evidence files have been removed from the case server. There is proof of tampering." The phrase levitated in the air like a warning flare. Tampering implied many things: bribery, coercion, a breach that could invalidate process, and above all, vulnerability. Now the case was not just about the defendant, it was about the security of an entire system. Blame spun like a cyclone. Fingers pointed at rival families, at hackers for hire, at internal betrayal. Matteo felt the old drums of war beat in his chest, familiar as trench mud. He suspected, with that soldier's intuition that had not entirely rusted, that the leak was both strategic and personal. Someone inside Almeida's network, someone trusted, had sold secrets. Or worse, someone had been bribed by a faction who wanted control. The Vieri Empire's reach meant enemies and partners of equal cruelty. The thought tightened his hands. Alessandra's eyes narrowed into focus. "Find them," she said to Dante. But the words were not merely an order. They were a plea disguised as command. Her empire had methods, private investigators, legal fixers, men who understood currency beyond money. But in a theater where files evaporated and lawyers fled, those methods felt thinner than their balance sheets advertised. Matteo watched her shift back into a role she had been groomed for. Strategist, leader, the woman who could pull extraction plans from thin air. It could have been intimidating, but instead, it was strangely humanizing. He saw her fatigue, years of making impossible choices, and he felt both compassion and unease. Her decisions had hurt people. She had also built livelihoods. The duality made him wary. He would defend her as she stood now, not the ledger of her past or the shadow of future crimes. A new problem thrummed under the courtroom like an approaching storm. Public sentiment was getting involved. Fate and feeds had aligned so that the world watched not only for law, but for narrative. Social accounts began running 1,000 theories, and a handful of influential voices twisted the moment into simple morality tales. Hero Janitor versus corrupt billionaire. a modern David and Goliath. That binary made Matteo wanted to retreat. He knew well the danger of being framed into a fairy tale. People simplified to suit consumption, and truth, messy, thorned, inconvenient, was usually the casualty. The first obstacle came in the form of an accusation leveled at Matteo himself. A junior journalist, hungry for traction, had dug into courthouse records and found a 10-year-old blot. Matteo had once testified in a shadowed case that led to the dismantling of a small syndicate cell. He had been a reluctant witness then, a civilian with knowledge he had almost buried. That testimony had cost lives and had earned Matteo a quiet, personal price. Old threats, an awareness that stories have tales. Now, the defense's weakness was being reframed. Alfredo Mancini, a lawyer for a rival family's interests, suggested a link between Matteo and a disgraced faction that had reasons to see the Vieri heir fall. The implication was a slow poison. Matteo was not impartial. He might be a planted actor, a last-ditch showman meant to muddy waters. The claim landed on him with a surprising force. People who had cheered a moment before suddenly recoiled, hungry for scandal. Alessandra's eyes flickered with a new concern. If Matteo had skeletons, and if those skeletons could be connected to forces that wanted her empire erased, then his protection might be a Trojan horse. Matteo felt the old fear rise: exposure. For a decade he'd been invisible, tending floors and memories. The idea that his past could be used as a lever to crush the woman he had pledged to defend outraged him and terrified him in equal measure. He had not sought danger for himself, it had always found him. Now it encircled not just him, but the woman who had become his impossible charge. "This is a setup," he told the nearest reporter. And he believed the words with the stark honesty of a man who had once held a rifle in a room that smelled like diesel and rain. He had not come to fame, he had come to atone, in ways small but fierce. He could not let his ghosts rewrite her fate. I stood up because she needed someone. That's it. Alessandra's recalculation was rapid and painful. Trust in her world was transactional. She could not give it away. Yet she also realized something else. The attack on Matteo was an attack on a narrative she could use. If the world cast him as a pawn, it would cast her as a puppet, and the puppet had always been dangerous because it was predictable. She needed unpredictability now, an ally who could humanize her and complicate the binary the press loved. But she also needed competence, loyalty she could measure and test. The problem was human. The solutions required both grit and grace. As the courtroom dissolved into procedural bedlam, Dante leaned close enough that only Alessandra could hear. "We should not be seen with him," he whispered. "He is liability." She looked at him, at the man whose life had been stitched to hers since childhood, and her reply was soft and terrible. He stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. That truth sat between them like an unwanted heirloom. It did not clear guilt, it complicated it. It gave Dante pause. It gave Matteo something neither of them expected: the beginning of plausible purchase in a world that dealt mostly in transactions. Outside, the gang networks hummed like reconfigured beehives, each rumor a threat or an opportunity. A hacked message thread, a private video clip, a deepfake cued to paint Matteo as a hired press stunt, all of it now threatened to detonate beyond the courthouse. The second act of the day had begun. Pushes and pulls not just in a room of oak and law, but across cables, encrypted channels, and human kingdoms that moved like magnets and mines. Matteo felt it, the tug of gravity between his oath and the complexity of the woman before him. He had promised a defense without knowing how to execute legal strategy. He had to learn quickly, to be more than a vow, to be a presence that could withstand a public trial and a private war. Alessandra needed him, not for legal acumen, but for a stubborn truth. Someone chose to stand. That choice, brittle and brave, had consequences neither could yet fully map. Run and preserve what remained invisible, or step fully into the fray and accept that visibility meant history could be rewritten in ways that would hurt more than one life. Matteo felt the old line resurfacing. You have to be willing to pay for what you protect. He had paid before with sleep and silence. Now the currency would be exposure, and perhaps worse. Alessandra rose from the witness box then, not to make a dramatic entrance, but to move through the court like a general repositioning weapons. She did not yet fold into affection for Matteo. That would be a sin against survival. But she did something that mattered more in that moment. She made him a function in her strategy. Stay, she told him, quietly, and with a command that was almost a covenant. If you will not be silent, be useful. Matteo's nod was simple. It was a promise and a pledge of work to come. He had no idea how to help a woman who ruled empires. He only knew how to be steady. That would have to be enough, for now. The prosecutor's tablet vibrated again like an insect in a jar. This time, the message was not a sterile alert. It was a packet of images that opened the courtroom like a wound. Screens in the gallery flickered as aides passed phones. Murmurs became a chorus. A journalist leaned forward and shouted, "There's video! An exfiltration! Server room footage! Someone brought files out!" The words had the shape of a detonator. Faces drained. The theater of law pooled into a real combustible thing. Matteo felt the floor tilt. The video showed a time-stamped shadow, a slim figure slipping into a maintenance corridor, a swipe card caught on a surveillance loop, hands moving with practiced economy through racks of servers. The recording was grainy, the angle oblique. Someone had wanted plausible deniability. But the badge used to open the server vault belonged unmistakably to one of Alessandra's trusted executives, a man Matteo had seen at charity galas and in closed-door meetings, a smiling negotiator who always smelled faintly of cologne and coercion. The image cut to a hand sliding a drive into a pocket. The courtroom inhaled like something sensing blood. "Who is that?" Alessandra demanded. Her voice lost the brittle polish and slipped into something raw, betrayal stripped of pretense. She looked at Dante, and for a second, those two were children again, stitched to each other by fate and shared immorality. Dante's face was a map of years. For the first time, it showed blankness. His hands, which had been confident in so many boardroom fights, now trembled minutely. "It's Luca," he said. The name an apology and a recognition. Luca Moretti. Luca Moretti. Handsome, ruthlessly efficient, head of operations. He was the man who oversaw logistics, whose spreadsheets had saved factories and allocated violence with the same neatness. He had been Alessandra's lieutenant, and sometimes, in rumor, her conscience. To see him on the feed stealing from the company was like watching a trusted muscle twitch into betrayal. "What does he have?" Alessandra asked, already knowing. In a world built on encrypted contracts and promises traded like currency, a drive could be a bomb. Compromised ledgers, covert payments, recorded orders, anything could be on there to ignite war or to dismantle an empire with the speed of a rumor. "Everything," Dante whispered. His voice carried defeat, not defiance. "Client lists, offshore accounts, contracts, communications, a map of who we pay and who we kill." Silence settled like a verdict. For Matteo, watching the betrayal unfold was less about finance and more about human consequence. Ledgers turned into lists of people. Each name on those spreadsheets could be a father, a nurse, an enforcer, a child fed on the profits of a criminal contract. The scale of what Luca had taken made the room feel suddenly microscopic and unbearably intimate. "You knew?" Matteo asked Dante, because some part of him clung stubbornly to the moral argument that truth ought to be confessed, if only for the dignity of the act. Dante's eyes did not leave Alessandra. No, he lied to me. He swore it was a transfer for supply rerouting. He stopped. The sentence collapsed. In their world, lies were tools, but this kind of lie, one that pulled the cord on a machine, felt like sabotage. Alessandra's jaw worked. She had always believed in control through knowledge, but the knowledge that someone she trusted had arranged an exfiltration felt like a blade in her chest. The realization fractured her into two motions, the analytic, who benefits, and the visceral, how many will die. Those motions collided into a silent scream. Outside the courtroom, the hack proliferated. Anonymous forums lit up with the drive's hashed fingerprints. Rival families whispered in encrypted channels and in smoky rooms, salivating at the instability. The deepfake factories, those shadowy studios that could manufacture a scandal in 72 hours, began churning. A counterfeit clip of Matteo leaving the server room, his uniform swapped in pixel-perfect forgery for a tuxedo, his mop replaced by a briefcase. The intent was surgical, to turn the janitor into a paid decoy, and thereby to turn public sentiment against him and into a weapon for those who wanted Alessandra crushed. The first deepfake took less than an hour to circulate. The video looped across feeds, accompanied by an article with the headline, "Janitor Caught in Coup to Destroy Vir Assets." Comments erupted. How gullible the public was, how easy it was to get a soundbite and a hero to build a story around emptiness. Matteo watched it appear on a reporter's phone, the pixelation of his face as convincing as someone had paid a surgeon to reshape his reputation. The familiarity of being seen and misread was a scar he carried. It opened like salt. "That's not me," he said, small and furious, but small because fury had a cost now. Every denial would be another clip. Every click would be ammunition. Alessandra looked at the screen and then at Matteo. The question that had simmered in her the second the lawyer fled, who was this man, flared into a more complicated calculus. In 2 hours, he had become a theorem of unpredictability, perhaps a liability, perhaps a gift. That he had stood was not enough. Trust could not be granted based on a single brave gesture in a room full of optics. She needed proof, but proof moved slowly, and the world moved at the speed of feeds. "Get me Luca," she said finally, the tone graveled to command. "Alive, preferably. If he has those files, we need to know why. We need to know who owns him." Dante's mouth was a hard line. "We can extract," he said, quietly. "Or we can go legal, issue a subpoena, tie it up. But if others already have copies, subpoenas are white flags." Alessandra considered both options like panels on a bridge she had to cross. Extraction was violence in black suit. Legal was violence in public. Both would cost. Both would likely cost more than money. She thought about the people who would be affected, the workers whose wages came through her channels, the families whose protection she provided in exchange for obedience. She thought of the prosecutor's tablet and of a justice system that could be bought, and she understood that neither action would absolve her. It only remapped consequences. "You go after Luca," she told Dante. "Careful, quiet, and see who crosses his trail. Matteo." She hesitated as if a private truth pressed against her fear. "Keep me informed. If someone tries to gaslight this into a sideshow, I want to know immediately." It was not an invitation to intimacy. It was a unit of purpose. But for Matteo, even that unit felt like advancement. He had wanted to stand. Now she made him part of the work. For a moment, he felt like a soldier issued a new order, not from rank, but from inclusion. Then the fracture widened. The prosecutor, sensing leverage, pounced in the only way he knew how, by criminalizing the human act. He demanded an investigation into the tampering, and in the same breath, Alfredo Mancini, the rival family's attorney turned opportunist, filed a claim that Matteo had previous ties to a dismantled syndicate and therefore had motive and history. Mancini's filing was a precise instrument. Throw doubt on the janitor and you discredit the human testimony he had offered. Discredit the testimony and the human truth in the room loses its edge. It was a classic move in a system designed to reward plausibility. The public reaction was instantaneous. Praise for Matteo curdled into suspicion. Supporters who had cheered the janitor minutes ago now asked for receipts. Alessandra saw the shift like a storm front. She felt the tug of two forces: gratitude for a man who had stood when the world had said step back, and the cold, strategic understanding that his exposure could be used by enemies to pull her down. "Why did you step up?" she asked Matteo when the courtroom settled into a brittle, uneasy silence. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she might have seen the memory writ beneath his composed face. The fog of a firefight, the small boy in a raincoat who'd once been left behind. A woman who'd whispered his name in a safe house and died. "Because you were falling," he said simply. "Because someone had to. Because I've watched people fall and wanted for a long time to stop it." His answer was both naive and lethal. In a world where motives were taxed, it was both a vulnerability and a declaration of code. Alessandra understood both. She felt something like pity. She felt something like affection. She felt the teeth of the world inch closer. Before she could respond, Dante interrupted. "We can't tie ourselves to a scandal about a janitor," he said. "It invites predators." "Predators are already here," she replied. "We either take action or we cede everything." That was the fracture. Dante wanted containment and traditional remedies. Alessandra, despite her empire's brutality, had a streak of unpredictability that sometimes made her a better general than cautious counsel. The schism between maintaining a facade and confronting a rot inside the house would widen into open discord. For Dante, Matteo was an unnecessary exposure. For Alessandra, Matteo, flawed, visible, unpredictable, had introduced a human variable that complicated the ledger, and maybe, she admitted privately, made her want something other than power that separated her from consequences. Later that day, when the courtroom finally recessed into a swarm of lawyers and aides, Matteo was pulled aside. Two men in plain clothes, not official police, but closely linked to Vieri security, informed him that someone had offered a bounty online on his head. Not just words, but coordinates, a whisper that could become action. The deepfake had done its work, painting him as a traitor. The bounty was an attempt to rewrite him into a villain for hire. "You should leave," one of the men said. "Disappear for a while." Matteo closed his eyes. He imagined the mop bucket, the quiet apartment, the laundromat downstairs. Disappear would be to fail the one human promise he'd made in a life that had become about avoiding being seen. He refused. The offer was not just practical advice, it was a severance of belief. "It's my choice," he said. "I chose to come forward." The men exchanged looks that had no romance for vows. One handed him a card with a number and said, "If you change your mind, call us. If you die, we're not the ones who failed you." It was the kind of brutality dressed as kindness their world knew well. Matteo's chest tightened. He had started a war not knowing what it would cost. He'd wanted to keep a woman from falling. Now, the consequences would test both of them. The betrayal by Luca, the deepfakes, Dante's caution, and the prosecutor's legal maneuvers had woven a net tight enough to catch anyone who moved. Trust, which had been a fragile commodity, had cracked. Alessandra watched Matteo leave the courtroom surrounded by men whose loyalty smelled of payment. She felt the word mercy prick her like a hush of rain. An inappropriate sentiment in her ledger, but also a new ache that had nothing to do with balance sheets. For the first time in a long time, she wondered what it would mean to be defended not by contracts, but by someone who owed her nothing and yet had chosen to protect her. The thought unsettled her more than any legal strategy. That night, in a car that glided through city streets where neon reflected like blood on pavement, Dante and Alessandra argued with the low ferocity of people who had long been partners. "You can't gamble with lives," he hissed. "And you can't be afraid to lose," she shot back. Their argument was a fracture that would widen. It forced both of them to confront what the Vieri Empire had become and what it cost to hold it together. For Matteo, the repercussions were immediate. His past resurrected as ammunition, his bravery rebranded as betrayal. For Alessandra, the leak was an incision revealing rot. Between them, the connective tissue of trust began to tear, and neither had a map for how to sew it back. The act of revelation had become an act of fracture. Allies turned eyes into weapons. Secrets, once private, were now currency in a war whose geography was both physical and digital. Matteo had defended a fall, and, in so doing, exposed a wound that might not heal. The promise to stay had become a crucible in which loyalties would be tested, and in that testing, some would be burnt away. As the city's lights passed like questions along the highway, Matteo thought of the boy in his memory, of small hands in the feel of a life being held, and realized with an aching clarity that defending someone meant sometimes becoming the only visible thing in a world that preferred unseen transactions. He had not asked for the price. He had only chosen to pay it. And as the night deepened, the fractures he had opened widened into a landscape of choices that would demand more than bravery. They would demand sacrifice, truth, and the willingness to be transformed by the cost of keeping a promise. The first gunshot sounded like a slammed door. It cut through the night air outside the safe house where Dante had tried to extract Luca. A neat, clinical operation gone ragged when Moretti realized he had been compromised. Matteo had been watching the feed on a borrowed tablet, gravity in his gut, when the video pinged sideways into chaos. A scuffle in a shadowed alley, a body hitting asphalt, a flare of red that meant someone had paid the price for betrayal. The shot made the room jump. Dante cursed, Alessandra went pale, and Matteo's hands, which had steadied soldiers and spilled coffee on late-night patrols, clenched until his knuckles were white. "You said alive," Alessandra hissed, breathless and suddenly small. "We tried," Dante said. His voice was a rasp. He had support, a pickup. We were ambushed. Matteo did not speak. He had watched death close enough before that his first reflex was not spectacle, but inventory. What had been lost? What could still be salvaged? He thought of Luca's face on the server footage. Hands that stole a drive, maybe hands that could have saved lives if they had been used differently. And felt a sick, complicated sympathy for a traitor who had become a live wire in a war he hadn't signed up for. "Then we go public," Alessandra said suddenly, the decision like a blade pulled taut. "We make them answer. If Luca is dead, we expose everything he stole. Let the world see the names who bought our vulnerability." Dante looked at her as if she had suggested detonating a bridge. "If we do that," he said, "careful, we blow up the whole architecture. Those names are our leverage. Publishing them is declaring war." Alessandra's jaw set like forged steel. "I didn't build a system to hide behind it," she said. "I built it to control outcomes. If the cost of control is secrecy that kills people, then secrecy dies. We do not trade lives for balance sheets." It was a proclamation, not a strategy. It was moral and dangerous in equal measure. Matteo felt the axis of the world shift beneath him. Alessandra had chosen public reckoning over quiet containment. In that choice lay both the promise of redemption for her and for those harmed by her edicts, and the certainty of retribution from enemies who would not suffer leaks lightly. "Go after the copies," Dante said, practical and exhausted. "We track distribution points, anonymous servers, seeders. If we can find the first node, we can find the buyer." Matteo stepped forward. "And the deepfakes?" he asked. "They'll paint me as a hired stunt. They'll make me the face of the lie. If you go public, they'll use me to discredit everything." Alessandra's eyes flicked to him with something like recognition, an ember of tenderness in brutal light. "You are not a prop, Matteo," she said. "If they make you into a villain, we'll show the man who stood up. We'll show what it costs to be human in a system that prefers monsters." Her words were less comfort than command. Still, they warmed a corner of Matteo that had been frost for years. He had not expected to be defended, not only by flesh and filings, but by the woman whose life he had tried to steady. The allegiance was dangerous and delicate, and felt, for the first breath since the courtroom, like something close to love, an unlikely bloom in a field of glass. They moved together, a small, ragged team, Alessandra with a boardroom's ruthlessness reoriented toward confession, Dante with his arsenals of men and contacts, Matteo with an unstated moral bar that didn't care for PR, but for human lives. They scheduled a controlled release. Documentation leaked carefully to journalists while legal teams countered with affidavits and witnesses. Alessandra sat for interviews she had avoided for decades. She confessed hard things with a voice that sometimes cracked. The factories that had been fronts, the contracts that had ended lives, the ordered strikes that had been justified by necessity. She said the words no heiress had ever pronounced in public in her world. "I was wrong. People died because of me. I will make it right." The admission unsettled allies and mortified rivals. Some donors fled, some activists cheered. Judges and prosecutors sharpened their knives. Mafia families smelled weakness and planned strikes. But in admitting, Alessandra had stolen a narrative that no deepfake could fully overwrite. She offered accountability. Accountability complicated appetites for revenge. It did not stop them, but it put new variables into the calculus. Matteo worked nights with Vieri's security team, tracing the leak's digital fingerprints. The work was detective and barter and literal elbow grease. It suited him oddly. He combed server logs, interviewed a frightened administrator who admitted to a bad password, and confronted a contractor who'd been paid off with offshore trinkets. Each revelation felt like stripping paint from rusted metal, ugly, slow, but necessary. He learned to speak in a new register, cybersecurity basics, chain of custody, timestamps. He still mopped floors when the windows were dark. He still cleaned his hands with the same practical rituals that had kept ghosts at bay. But he had a new set of tools and a new reason for them. 2 nights later, they found a node, an anonymous host in Lisbon that had been used to seed the drive. It led to a name, Rinaldo Costa, a fixer with ties to a rival family who'd been quietly buying influence in judicial pockets. Tracking him wasn't simple. The man employed shadows. They didn't have legal warrants that would hold in court, but they had time and a willingness to bend rules. Alessandra authorized an extraction. Matteo did not expect to be the one to go. Yet when Dante hesitated, seeing in his face the cost of sending a cleaner into a den of guns and ghosts, Alessandra looked at Matteo as if she were placing a medal on his chest. "You went public," she said. "You stood. Walk into this with me." He met her gaze and understood the unspoken terms. This mission might demand a sacrifice beyond anonymity. It might demand blood. He had tasted loss before. He had never regretted stepping into harm to keep someone upright. This time, his charge was not just the life of a woman who had built empires. It was a chance to reshape how that empire functioned. They moved at midnight in a compact black sedan. Alessandra, once unaccustomed to risk outside of spreadsheets and boardrooms, was a different kind of soldier tonight. Hands steepled, jaw set, carrying the weight of apology and command. Dante drove. Matteo sat in the back with a compact rifle he had been lent by a man who trusted him because he had seen the night's edges Matteo knew. The ride smelled of leather, cologne, and something like resolve. The ambush was not in the alleys, but in a warehouse by the docks. Rinaldo's men were many and obvious. A perimeter of cheap SUVs, a line of bodies that meant business. Matteo felt all old training pod into a single thing. Move, observe, don't hesitate. Alessandra's security moved like a force he'd never imagined, a ballet of brutality and precision. He wanted to curl into safety and instead moved forward, because she had already asked him. They breached together. Flashbangs, a chorus of shouts, the metallic bloom of gunfire. Violence had a choreography, and they learned it late. Matteo saw a young man fall, clutching a bleeding shoulder. He saw a woman with a child on her hip backed into a crate. He saw Alessandra cut through the chaos like a blade, eyes a mix of grief and focus. In the server room, a man tried to burn drives. Matteo lunged, pulled the drive from the flames with gloved hands, and felt the heat of it at his fingers as if he had taken something living. Rinaldo himself found them then, surrounded by his men. Alessandra stepped forward, unafraid, and in that moment, Matteo made a calculation that was not tactical, but entirely personal. He took 2 steps before thinking, one to shield her, and another to make sure the drive, the proof, would not be erased. A bullet found the air next to his temple, another grazed his shoulder. He tasted iron. He fell into the world of noise and light, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Alessandra on her knees, not pulling away, but holding him, the world narrowing to the pulse under his palm. "You idiota," she whispered, a laugh that broke and reformed. "You do this stupid, brave thing." "Had to," Matteo said, breath ragged. "Had to keep you standing." She pressed a hand to his chest, felt the beat like a small animal. For the first time, she held someone who had willingly walked into her war, not for payment, but for a promise. Her fingers were warm and steady. Around them, men were cuffed and Rinaldo dragged off. Dante barked orders that made the operation coherent. The drive was safe, though their victory smelled of sacrifice. Back in the car, under fluorescent hospital lights, Matteo's wound was stitched. It was not fatal, just deep enough to be a geography of pain for weeks. Alessandra sat beside him, holding his hand as if it were a relic, faulty and human. He looked at her and saw tears he had not expected from a titan, raw and personal. She had given orders that had killed. She was trying to make it right now, publicly, painfully. "I offered myself to be useful," Matteo said when the morphine's edges softened. "I didn't offer anything else." Alessandra's answer was a small, dangerous thing. "You saved me," she said, the words fragile as currency. "Not from scandal, not from law, from falling." She swallowed. "I've spent my life buying protection when I should have paid respect. Stay." It was not a command, it was a plea. He looked at her, the billionaire who could erase him with an account, and found himself wanting something more than gratitude. "I won't take your money," he said, "but I will help you make it right." She smiled then, a slow, ragged arc that felt like forgiveness and promise bundled into one. "Then help me change it," she said. "Help me make a system that doesn't demand so many falls." He squeezed her hand and felt the future, a brittle, uncertain thing, press back. They were not equals in ledger, but in that moment they had a shared ledger of cost and a mutual reckoning that felt like a beginning. Outside, the city pushed nights and headlines into the dark. Inside the hospital room, two people who had never belonged together began to rewrite what being defended could mean. Not a contract, not a shield bought, but an agreement between two flawed humans to protect each other with honesty and sacrifice. When Mateo finally closed his eyes, the thought that held him was simple and terrible and hopeful. Defending someone sometimes required giving yourself up so they could be better. It was a dangerous currency, but it was the only one he had left to offer. The nights after the raid felt like an aftershock. Too much noise, too many reporters, too many hands offering condolence that came with questions. But the shape of things had changed. Alessandra, true to the confession she'd made under pressure and pain, began dismantling the parts of her company that had been used as weapons. She set new oversight in place, independent audits, a board with people who had no appetite for secrecy, protections for workers who had been collateral in old deals. She issued public reparations where she could, not to erase what was broken, but to build scaffolding where people could stand. It was messy and imperfect, and it was honest in a way the empire never had been. Mateo refused a payout when legal settlement offers arrived. Money could buy silence, and silence had been the old currency that cost lives. Instead, he accepted a job title that sounded ridiculous on paper, but felt right in the chest. Steward of Community Projects, an operational role that put him in charge of trenches and neighborhoods rather than ledgers and accounts. He supervised rebuilding clinics, negotiated protections for union organizers, and taught young men how to fix doors and servers with equal patience. He still mopped when it mattered, because ritual kept his ghosts at bay, but his hands now touched policy as well as tile. Their relationship did not arrive with fireworks or a tidy romance clause. It arrived in small, stubborn things. Alessandra bringing him coffee at dawn in an industrial hoodie she had cut from a suit. Mateo slipping a clean bandage into her briefcase before a public testimony. Nights where they argued about ethics and then sat quiet. Two people shaped by different violences learning the language of apology. Trust was earned molecule by molecule. Forgiveness was slow, and sometimes they failed. But each failure taught them new ways to be accountable. Enemies retaliated. The deepfakes returned in darker editions, lawsuits dragged into the press, a few violent reprisals tested their walls. But the narrative had shifted. The admissions and the visible reparations made it harder for rivals to paint Alessandra as only a monster or Mateo as only a pawn. They had become, in public and private, a scandal of humanity, uneven people trying to do better. Months later, on a low rooftop above a neighborhood clinic Mateo had helped fund, they watched dawn cut the city into honest lines. Alessandra had her hand in his. His thumb traced the scar near his collarbone like a map. Neither of them pretended the past was clean. Neither of them promised a future without storms. But the skyline looked less like a series of towers to be conquered and more like a city to be kept. She leaned into him, not as heiress to an empire, but as a woman who had learned how to ask for help. He leaned into her, not as a savior, but as someone who would stand. Together, they watched smoke and sunlight braid over the streets below, and for the first time, both of them felt how defense could be love, not a contract, but a covenant made in the soft light of a new morning.